Have you ever wondered what the static of a lie sounds like? That constant, low-frequency hum beneath the words you are told, the white noise of a system determined to obscure the truth. Or what sound the absolute, terrifying truth makes when it finally cuts through the static, clean and cold, leaving you breathless and utterly alone. I am an old woman now, 85 years of dust and memory settling over me. And my hands, once quick and certain over the teleprinter keys, are slow and knotted with time. But they remember. They remember the texture of the smooth bakelite, the faint smell of ozone and burnt oil from the radio shack, the insistent, almost frantic rhythm of a message being born. For years, decades, my life was defined by the wire, by the airwaves. My entire existence as a Nakrich Tenhilferin, a signals auxiliary, was built on the mechanical precision of communication. A dot was a dot. A dash was a dash. Code was clarity. I believed that if you transmitted the message cleanly, mathematically, the meaning would be clear. I believed in the sacred distinction between the signal, our vital truth, and the noise, their meaningless lies. The war, however, taught me that the signal and the noise are often the exact same thing, just depending on which side of the receiver you stand, and how loudly the men in power scream to drown out the quiet, inconvenient facts. Before the end, I saw the world through a lens of coded desperation. We were the bulwarks, the guardians of European civilization, defending our homes against the barbarians, the racially impure, the vengeful forces determined to annihilate our people and enslave our nation. I didn't just hear the propaganda. I processed it. I typed the triumphant reports of early victories, the complex logistical orders, and the grim, increasing casualty counts. I saw the war's fury filtered through the detached language of communiques. The destruction of cities became statistical loss. The frantic plays for medical aid became priority 2 transmission. The final months were a descent into coded chaos, watching the collapse unfold through Morse code and the frantic, broken signals of men realizing they were abandoned. The messages were concrete proof of our righteousness, of their coming depravity. I knew what to expect when the end came, when the Americans finally dragged me, stunned and filthy, across the ruined landscape of the Rhine crossings. I expected the screaming. I expected the vengeance, the kind of malice only the Jewish Bolshevik Anglo-American monstrosity could wield. I had steeled myself for the inevitable torture, the humiliation I had read about in the official reports. Instead, they sent me to Texas. Camp Hereford, a name that tastes like dust and soft, lazy indifference on the tongue. It felt like a cruel joke played by the fates. I had prepared myself for a dungeon, for brutality that would at least confirm my beliefs. I had steeled my mind for martyrdom. And what did I find? Meticulously mown lawns, absurdly green against the dry, baked earth. Uniform rows of green-painted wooden barracks under an impossibly vast, clear blue sky. A shocking contrast to the bomb-cratered ruins I had left behind. The constant, disorienting sound was the chirr of persistent cicadas, the rhythmic clang of a distant mess hall bell, and the unexpected crack of a baseball bat from the recreation field, sounds that had no right existing in a world defined by the artillery's roar. The sheer, unsettling abundance was the most potent weapon. The food, though simple, was clean and sufficient. The beds, though institutional, were covered with clean sheets. This unnatural calm, this foreign decency, was more corrosive than any torture. It chipped away at the foundation of my ingrained hatred, day by day, leaving me terrified of the vacuum opening up inside my own head. My comrades, the staunch women who clung to the party's shattered promise, they whispered constantly. They insisted it was a trick, a clever allied deception. They said the mask would fall, that the true, savage nature of the American race would eventually be revealed. And I, fiercely loyal, fiercely pragmatic, tried to believe them. I held onto my defiant pride like a brittle shield, convinced that any moment, the monsters would finally appear to confirm my worldview. And then's one afternoon, the air still heavy with the sweet scent of sun-baked pine needles mingling with the faint, sterile tang of disinfectant, a different smell brought the war back to me. It wasn't the scent of gunpowder or despair, but the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and adrenaline, cut through by the sickly sweet odor of ether wafting from the camp infirmary. It was the clinical smell of necessary pain. And I heard a sound that was not a coded message, but raw and immediate. The desperate, hushed urgency of men trying to save a life. That smell, the clinical, agonizing smell of a wound that won't close, that is the sensory trigger that pulls me back. It is the scent of a broken machine needing a technician. On that day, I was the only technician available. I step back into that moment now, decades stripped away, standing defiant in the middle of a Texas field, waiting for the monsters to show themselves. And instead, I found a man asking for help. He was young. This American doctor, Elias Vance. His khaki uniform was rumpled, perpetually damp with sweat and stress, and his face was a stark map of exhaustion and raw human fear. It was the kind of fear I had seen reflected in the eyes of my own retreating officers, the fear that makes your jaw ache and your hands shake, the fear of losing something you cannot afford to lose. He didn't look like the triumphant conqueror I had been taught to despise. He looked like a tired boy who hadn't slept in 3 days. He approached me near the wire fence, away from the casual observation of the guards, holding a piece of equipment in his hands like a sacred, broken thing. It was a field cipher machine, a compact, sturdy piece of German engineering, a model I knew intimately. The Enigma-lite. We called it smaller, simplified, but essential for tactical field communications. He spoke not shouting, not demanding with the arrogance of victory, but pleading. His German was clumsy, heavy, like trying to lift a waterlogged sack of flour with inadequate strength. Helfen Sie mir, bitte, help me, please. He repeated it, the German word for please sounding utterly foreign on his American tongue, yet piercingly clear in its intent. He pointed to the machine, then to paper scrawled with a cryptic sequence of numbers and letters, then to the small, white infirmary building where the smell of ether was strongest. So that, verwundet, sehr schlecht, wir müssen, fliegen, schneller, weiter, rot. He fumbled for the precise words. He explained, through a combination of broken language and desperate gestures, that they had a severely wounded American soldier, one of their own, critically injured, whose life depended on an urgent medical evacuation. An airlift, but a vital component of the captured German cipher machine, which they were using to communicate with a forward air base or maybe an Allied ground unit with specialized knowledge, was either jammed, set incorrectly, or simply beyond their immediate understanding. They needed to decipher a critical message, likely a localized weather report or perhaps information about unexpected enemy stragglers on a flight path, to coordinate a safe and rapid evacuation. The life of this single American soldier, one of them, depended on the correct sequence of rotors, on the right plugs in the right sockets. The sheer, profound absurdity of the situation seized me. Locking my breath in my chest, I was a prisoner of war, an enemy soldier, a fascist menace according to the communiques I had processed, and this man, this embodiment of the victorious Allies, was not demanding information about my army's disposition. He was begging me to save one of his own. He was bypassing the chains, the uniforms, the entire apparatus of war, and appealing only to the technician in me, to the woman who knew the code. My mind, indoctrinated by years of rigid ideology, roared with a visceral, blinding rage. Traitor, betrayal, you swore an oath. They are the enemies. They deserve what they get. If you touch that machine for them, you dishonor every man who fell for the fatherland. I could feel the invisible heat of the loyalists' eyes on my back, the small, rigid faction of German women in the camp who maintained their fierce belief. Their cold pride, their silent judgment was a physical weight on my shoulders, a sudden, cold terror in the hot Texan air. They represented the collective honor I felt obligated to uphold. To assist was an unthinkable act of treason against our shared suffering and belief system. But then, my gaze fell back to the machine. It was familiar. It was logic. It was a language I spoke better than German, better than my mother tongue. The sight of the misplaced plug on the patchboard, the slightly misaligned rotor, triggered an almost involuntary, professional response. My fingers twitched, sensing the necessary rotation of the wheels, the subtle click of the keys. It was a physical ache to correct the error, to bring order to the chaos. And then I looked back at Dr. Vance. His eyes were not cold, not hateful. They were simply desperate, wide with a universal anxiety that transcends nationality. He wasn't seeing a Nazi. He was seeing a tool, a means to an end. He was seeing a skill set. He was seeing a way to save a life. I walked toward the infirmary. Each step was a quiet, internal execution of the self I had been taught to be. It was an act of profound, agonizing treason against my flag. The air inside was thick with heat, sweat, and the overpowering smell of sickness. I glanced quickly at the soldier on the cot. He was young, impossibly pale, strapped down, his breathing shallow and rattling. His uniform was dark with a patch of fresh blood, stark against the white sheets. He wasn't a barbarian. He was a piece of shattered humanity, a machine broken beyond repair, just like the bodies I had seen mentioned in the grim dispatches I typed. Regardless of the uniform they wore. Dr. Vance placed the cipher machine on a clean metal table, slightly slick with disinfectant. My fingers, guided by years of disciplined muscle memory, moved before my conscience could stop them. I leaned over the box. The mechanism was sticky with misuse. I immediately saw the simple, fundamental error. A misplaced plug in the patchboard, a beginner's mistake born of haste and stress. I felt a surge of cold, clinical annoyance at the technical failure, a temporary disconnect from the situation's moral weight. My mind was still screaming, "Stop, you are aiding the enemy, you are a disgrace to the uniform." But my hands were working, the smooth, hard texture of the rotor wheels under my touch. The satisfying, tiny click as I aligned the indicator rings to the starting position from the coded slip. I moved the plug to the correct socket. I typed the coded sequence from the paper with the familiar, quick tap of my fingers. I heard the quiet, rhythmic swack of the output letters being printed onto the thin strip of paper. It was a detailed meteorological report. Crucial information for high-altitude flight safety over difficult terrain. I pushed the decoded slip of paper toward Dr. Vance. I didn't speak a single word. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, the sound of my betrayal would be audible across the camp. He took the paper. His fear didn't vanish instantly, but a profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over his features, making him look even younger, even more exhausted. He didn't thank me with flowery speeches or promises of release. He simply looked at me, a long, searching look that saw past the uniform, past the hatred, straight into the terrified, competent woman beneath. He reached out not to touch me, but to simply place a clean, unopened packet of American cigarettes, Camels, a forbidden, unimaginable luxury I hadn't seen in years, on the table beside the machine. A silent, nonverbal transaction, a professional courtesy paid for a professional service. Then he turned and ran, shouting orders in rapid, sharp English, the slip of paper clutched tightly in his hand. I stood there, staring at the cigarettes, my fingers still tingling from the work. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, and terrifying. It wasn't the silence of a battlefield lull. It was the silence of a destroyed belief system. The enemy did not torture me. The enemy did not humiliate me. The enemy simply asked me to do my job, and when I did, they acknowledged my skill. They treated me as a professional, as a human being whose expertise had value. I moved to the small, dusty window. In the distance, a small twin-engine transport plane, probably a C-47, was already taxiing, then accelerating down the rough airstrip they had hastily prepared. It lifted slowly, climbing into the impossibly vast blue of the Texan sky, carrying the life I had helped save, a life whose name I would never know, a life that belonged to the enemy. And as the plane became a distant speck, a terrifying, isolating realization settled upon me, colder than any snow I had ever felt in Russia. The barbarians were decent. The monsters were just men in different uniforms, capable of desperation, capable of recognizing a common need, capable of professional respect. My hatred, my pride, my core belief, it was all static. It was all a carefully constructed lie. And the truth, that plain, cold, terrifying truth, had just flown away on a single sheet of decoded paper. My world, built on the rigid lines of code and ideology, had shattered, leaving me profoundly, terrifyingly alone in the wake of a simple act of human competence. The women in the barracks, the true believers, they saw the transaction. They saw the American cigarettes sitting beside my cot. They didn't need to know the decoded message, the critical nature of the weather report, or the dying soldier. They saw a collaboration. They branded me, not with a physical mark, but with a chilling, absolute silence. I was a ghost among my own kind, a traitor who had traded our collective honor for a pack of American tobacco. They saw a betrayal of the Fuhrer. I saw a fleeting, necessary collaboration with humanity. I never smoked those Camels. They sat on the shelf by my cot for the entire remainder of my imprisonment, gradually turning brittle and yellow under the Texas sun. They were my scar, a physical, mundane reminder of the day my moral certainty fractured. They were the evidence of a moment where the lines I was trained to defend dissolved into mist. I came back to Germany after the war, but I never truly came home. The precision I once loved, the clean, binary logic of code, it was ruined for me. How could I ever trust a message again when I knew the entire framework of my life's most important message had been a sophisticated, deadly lie? The men who sent me into war told me the enemy was pure evil. The enemy, through a young doctor's desperate plea, showed me they were simply human. Before Camp Hereford, I believed in the absolute purity of the signal. The signal was us. The noise was them. My entire career as a signals auxiliary was dedicated to ensuring that the signal got through untainted. But Dr. Vance, with his broken German and his desperate, exhausted eyes, he taught me that the most important signals are often those sent not by radio, but by the sheer, uncodable desperation of a human being in crisis. And that signal, the silent, agonizing plea for life, is universal. It crosses every wire, every language, every ideological divide. The great tragedy of that war, of all wars, is not just the physical destruction, the flattening of cities. It is the careful, surgical destruction of conscience. They build walls of ideology and propaganda so high that you cannot possibly see the person on the other side. They train you to hear only static, to interpret decency as a trick and desperation as a weakness to exploit. They teach you to believe that the enemy is a concept, pure, unredeemable evil, not a man with a mother or a brother, or a life dangling precariously from the thread of a single, deciphered weather report. I spent the rest of my working life in post-office communications, routing simple, honest mail, watching the flow of correspondence travel between people who were finally allowed to speak to one another without code, without censorship, without the heavy hand of the state filtering their words. But I never forgot that day in Texas. I never forgot the smell of the disinfectant mixed with blood, or the heavy silence that followed the thwack-thwack-thwack of the teleprinter keys. I had been told since childhood that my nation was fighting for a glorious, transcendent future. But the most glorious, terrifying moment of clarity I ever experienced was when I realized the life I saved belonged to a man I was supposed to hate, and that my professional skill, divorced from the heavy chains of ideology, was just a simple tool for universal good. The true line between good and evil, the only line that truly matters, runs not between nations or armies or uniforms or flags, but straight through the confused, vulnerable heart of every single person. And you sitting there listening to the echoes of my quiet internal war, decades after the fact. Do you know where your line is drawn? Are you listening only to the signal you want to hear, the comfortable, reinforcing voice of your tribe? Or are you willing to reach across the conceptual wire, past the blinding static of your own convictions, and acknowledge the shared, fragile humanity of the person standing opposite you? That is the true code. It is the hardest one to break, because it requires you to dismantle the walls you have meticulously built around your own heart. It requires the terrifying, isolating acceptance that sometimes the monster you were taught to fear is the man who desperately needs your help, and the most dangerous enemy is the conviction you hold that you already know the whole, simple truth. The truth is never simple. It is complex, messy, and often painful. I am Greta Neumann. I was a signals auxiliary, and I finally learned that the most important message in the world is always uncoded. It is simply a plea, and how you answer that plea defines who you are, long after the noise of battle fades away.